NASA reports that climate change is the warming of global temperatures that will continue to rise for decades to come, largely due to greenhouse gases produced by humans. In Africa's countries, the effects of climate change include increased heat, drought, insect outbreaks, increased wildfires, declining water supplies, reduced agricultural yields, health impacts, and flooding and erosion. In Africa, the people depend largely on farming and agriculture for most of their food. In the next few decades, we will see a large increase in urbanization of developing countries in Africa. With a growing urban population comes an increase in population size. Agriculture employs 65% of Africa's labor force and accounts for 32% of gross domestic product. Agriculture is essential to the survival of the people who live in rural areas. Some experts say that the temperature of the Earth will increase by 4 degrees Celsius by the year 2050, causing massive damage to particular countries in Africa. Africa will be one of the areas that is hit the hardest and will lead to a loss of livelihood. Economists and policymakers aim to spur a green revolution in Africa. According to the UN Population Fund's State of the World Population 2007 report, 72% of sub-Saharan Africa's urban population currently lives under slum conditions. An increase in urbanization would be great for Africa's economy, but this major shift cannot happen while the imminent threats of climate change are still an issue. Recent data from southern Africa shows chronic poverty and food insecurity in 11 cities. If there is not enough food for people now, how will Africa support its population while the effects of climate change only worsen? The indigenous people of Africa will lose their crops but also their livestock when the full effects of climate change hit. In Africa, more than 200 million people rely on livestock as their main source of income. They sell milk, meat, and even skins to keep their families alive. Just the livestock contributes to about 30% of gross value of agricultural production. Having all of these livestock does require a certain amount of food to feed them, which they do not possess. There will be massive droughts and scarcity of water. They are going to lose crops such as maize, common bean, cassava, sorghum, yam, finger millet, as well as coffee. These vital crops aren't just grown for food consumption, they are also grown for sale, which will be a huge loss not only for the family income, but for the economy itself. With the loss of their crops, the people in Africa are facing serious threats. At the country level, West African countries in or near the Sahel area are projected to be the most negatively impacted, with 70% decreases in suitable areas for crops. The common bean is an important source of nutrition and food security for many African countries. However, the common bean yield is also highly sensitive to climate change effects. The common bean, maize, and finger millet are projected to reduce their suitable areas by 30 to 50% across the continent of Africa. In Mozambique, Uganda, and Tanzania, suitability for Arabica coffee production will decrease by more than 50%, and suitability in Burundi and Rwanda will decline by 20 to 50%. Maize is also very vulnerable to the effects of climate change. Research shows that almost 90% of currently cropped maize area is projected to experience negative impacts. West African countries in particular will feel the negative impacts, with mean production losses between 20 and 40% by 2050. With the impacts of climate change, there will be an increase in starving children in Africa due to the lack of agricultural production. Studies have shown that by 2050, there will be a massive decline in food availability in developing countries. The number of African countries facing severe food shortages has doubled over the past 2 decades as extreme weather conditions and natural disasters disrupt farming across the continent. United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization reports as many as 24 countries are struggling with food shortages across sub-Saharan Africa, twice as many as in 1990. East and Central Africa are most affected, with more than 30% of people in the 2 regions classified as undernourished. The people who are living in rural areas need the ability to secure sufficient income to be able to afford food and other basic necessities, which are dependent on wages and prices, but also include other factors, such as the effect of a crowded and unhygienic environment. Without the lower class being taken care of, urbanization can never really be successful in most African countries. Recent work on the common bean at the International Center for Tropical Agriculture demonstrates a potential game changer in new breeding experiments. For some 50% of bean-growing areas, where heat stress is a major constraint, beans that can tolerate a change of up to 3 degrees Celsius increase have been successfully bred in greenhouse trials. This could carry the East African common bean throughout all the 21st century climate conditions. For global coffee producer East Africa, climate change will most likely lead to two events. 1. An overall reduction in Arabica growing areas, and 2. A replacement of heat-stressed Arabica areas by the more heat-tolerant Robusta plant. The National Adaptation Plan was established by the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. This plan will help facilitate effective medium and long-term adaptation planning and implementation in least developed countries. This focused primarily on climate adaptation in agriculture, but also included water, forest, and land use. More tolerant crop varieties need to be developed, particularly for droughts, floods, and pest infestations. New varieties could contribute to adaptation and increase productivity. They could reduce projected reductions in yields by up to 15%. The effects of climate change can be mitigated by sustainable land use, forest management, and carbon sequestration, which is long-term or short-term storage of carbon dioxide. The restoration of degraded lands can increase soil carbon and crop yields, while contributing to the conservation of agricultural biodiversity. Furthermore, conservation tillage cultivation could be promoted, reducing some of agriculture's negative impacts on the natural environment.